This lecture discusses how the relationship between society and the environment can be viewed as problematic. Just as the natural environment impacts human behavior, different societies in different climates eat different indigenous foods, use different materials for shelter, etc., human behavior also impacts the environment. Since the Industrial Revolution, human waste has increased at a rapid and arguably unsustainable rate. As natural resources are transformed into goods and services at a larger scale, pollution, waste, and other environmental disturbances are generated. As fuel, used to generate production, and waste, left over after consumption, are burned, carbon gases are released into the atmosphere. Recall the graph from your readings that demonstrated the correlation between industrialization and the increase in global carbon emissions. More on links between carbon emission and environmental impact will be discussed below. Mass industry has led to industrial agriculture, also known as factory farming. Industrial agriculture describes farming and animal husbandry at a very large scale. Factory farming of animals has led to a massive scale of animal waste. Recall the clips about poultry waste generated by chicken farms from your readings this week. Mass industry has also led to the destruction of rainforests globally. Between 1990 and 2005, Brazil lost over 160,000 miles of rainforest due to deforestation. One of the problems with deforestation, according to environmental advocates, is that the loss of rainforest leads to a loss of species and ecological diversity. Though rainforests cover only 7% of the Earth's landmass, they account for 50% of Earth's species of plants and animals. Trees are also important because they convert carbon dioxide to oxygen. As the number of trees is diminished, this natural process can become unbalanced. Humans are also creating an ever-increasing amount of solid waste. Solid waste refers to the garbage that we throw away in the trash every day after consuming food and other products, as well as the waste generated when producing these goods. Americans generated 250 million tons of waste in 2010. All of that waste needs to go somewhere. Each American produces 4.43 pounds of trash a day. This is up from 2.7 pounds in 1960. It's almost doubled. Though recycling helps, only about 1/3 of all trash is recycled. Chemical pollution is another major byproduct of mass industry that impacts the environment. Over 4 billion pounds of toxic chemicals are released by companies into the environment each year. Though the dumping of many of these chemicals is regulated, companies usually select the cheapest possible option for disposal. The cheapest options are often not the most environmentally friendly. We learned in the previous module, some corporations choose to engage in criminal behavior, and fines for illegal dumping might actually be cheaper for companies than alternative modes of waste management. Chemical pollution negatively affects human life as well as animal life. Carcinogenic chemicals can increase cancer rates when dumped in populated areas. Those that study environmental injustice and inequality point out that those communities in the U.S. with less power bear a disproportionate share of exposure to environmental hazards. Factories, power plants, waste treatment plants, and dumps are more likely to be located in or near low-income neighborhoods. Companies and government agencies often opt to put waste facilities, landfills, and other environmental hazards in these neighborhoods because the communities have less political power and influence than neighborhoods with more wealth and resources. Recent government reports have confirmed that racial and ethnic minorities and those living below the poverty line are put at greater risk of exposure to environmental hazards. This unequal distribution of the benefits and hazards of environmental law and regulation is referred to as environmental injustice. Similarly, poorer nations bear greater burden for global trash and pollution. One component of this is the global waste trade. Wealthy industrial countries tend to produce more trash and then export the trash by paying other poorer nations to take it. Recall the interactive web page from PBS in your reading folder. Make sure to scroll over the US, Europe, Ghana, and China. What were the differences between the US and Europe in the ways that they deal with e-waste? What were some of the effects on Ghana and China? Who are the recipients of e-waste? Not only do richer nations shift the burden of dealing with the world's waste to poorer nations, but richer nations produce much more waste than poorer nations. This chart demonstrates this fact. Compare the world's richest 20% of the population to the world's poorest 20%. The world's richest 20% eat 45% of all meat and fish consumed globally, use 58% of the world's total energy, use 84% of all paper, own 87% of the world's vehicles. Compare this to the world's poorest 20%, who eat 5% of all meat and fish consumed globally, use 4% of the world's total energy, use 1% of all paper, own less than 1% of the world's vehicles. This disparity in consumption by the rich and poor is referred to as the consumption gap. Wealthy countries consume 3 times as much food and water, 10 times the energy and timber, 13 times as much iron and steel, 14 times as much paper, and 18 times the amount of chemicals as poor nations. Because consumption is higher in wealthier nations, it follows that there is also a difference in the amount of pollution generated. This is known as the pollution gap. For instance, wealthy nations produce 12 times as much carbon dioxide, what is considered by many to be a harmful greenhouse gas, as poorer nations.